Well, the nation's banks are being urged to help scam victims and refund the money they lose at the hands of thieves. Labor MP Jerome Laxale has been grilling executives from the big banks about what they're doing to help scam victims as they appeared before the House Economics Committee. We spoke to Jerome Laxale on that issue and the Commonwealth Bank boss's views on renters a short time ago. Jerome Laxale, welcome back to Afternoon Briefing. You and I have spoken in the past about the sort of pressures that are on renters across your electorate, but more broadly across Australia. It seems like the Commonwealth Bank Chief Executive is also identifying that a lot of young renters are under significant financial stress at the moment. Were you surprised by anything that he had to say to your committee this morning?
Look, in terms of renters, no, I'm not surprised. What I was surprised last time we spoke was that the RBA didn't seem to have a handle on the impact of rate rises on renters. I think they've done an about-face on that in response to some of those questioning. So, no, I'm not surprised the banks are seeing that. They also have the data that matches. I think the CBA have that data set which has been reported on, which shows that renters and people in their 30s and 40s are bearing the brunt of interest rate rises, and they're cutting the most out of their budgets. Their reduction in spending is the highest compared to other age sets, which seem still to be spending quite liberally. Interesting feedback, interesting data, and it's important that the RBA takes all that into consideration when they consider rate rises and its impact.
What other sort of insights have you been getting from the big banks as to how they see the economy tracking along at the moment?
I've been really focusing on scamming and scammers, particularly, their response to what's a pretty extraordinary phenomenon here in Australia. Over $3.1 billion has been lost to scamming. That's an increase of 80% on the year before, and only 2 to 5% is recovered by Australian banks, whereas that in the UK is as high as 66%. So I've been trying to understand why Australian banks don't do more to protect consumers from scammers or to refund consumers. And, I'll be honest, I'm not too impressed with some of their responses there, Matt.
Jerome Laxale, do you believe it's because the banks are simply putting this in the too hard basket, or they don't see this as their responsibility?
Look, I think they don't see it as their responsibility, which is pretty disappointing, I've got to say. People use banks to keep their money safe, and it's quite extraordinary, some of the stats that we've got out of the ACCC. Last year alone, $3.1 billion was lost to scams. That's up 80%. Seniors and people from a non-English speaking background are overrepresented in those stats. And we know that the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, the Ombudsman, which is funded by the big banks, say that banks don't have that responsibility. But the ACCC make it pretty clear that banks need to start doing more. They need to start monitoring transactions. Compare our system to that of the UK, where banks voluntarily started to refund money to people who fall victim to scammers, even if by mistake. They started refunding money to the tune of up to 66% of money is returned. Here in Australia, that's 2 to 5%. So there's a huge difference between both systems there, and quite rightly, many in our community are wondering why Australian banks aren't doing more. The ACCC's wondering why banks aren't doing more. So I think it's the time's right for Minister Jones to commence that conversation. And if we have to go to a mandatory model, I think there's enough community sentiment there to go to. I call on the banks to just start doing it voluntarily, as they did in the UK. There's no reason why banks can't start refunding more customers starting next week.
When you're talking about the UK model there, it's clearly a voluntary model at the moment, but there are moves afoot to make it mandatory. That voluntary model, can you give us a bit of an insight? Was that brought about because of community sentiment there? Were the banks sort of dragged to this situation?
No, look, I don't think so. So a voluntary reimbursement model was introduced in 2019, and one bank in particular that I've done some research on, TSB, was the first to do it. They refund about 97% of the scam complaints that they get, including in scenarios where people tricked, or investment scams, and stuff like that. Their bank CEOs on the record are saying that this hasn't impacted them as much as they would think. It's certainly not underwriting criminals, and which is what some of the Australian banks have said in the last day or two. So, and it also encourages the bank to ensure that they're keeping a closer eye on some of these transactions. Like, I can go to I can buy a cocktail in Bali and my credit card will be blocked. But here in Australia, you can send money to a brand new bank account and there's hardly any warnings. And, I think there's a lot more that banks here in Australia can do. Not necessarily copying word for word what happens in the UK, because obviously our banking systems are different, but they can do a lot more to help victims of scammers overcome some of the absolutely horrendous losses that they're getting at the moment through the banking system.
I'm sure you're not alone in using that example. Many of our viewers may well have had their card blocked while sipping bintangs on the beach in Bali over their time. It is an interesting perspective that you're putting forward, but you seem to be putting a lot of responsibility on the banks here, and clearly they are the ones who have to act and pay back that money. But is there a role for the government to step in here and bring about some sort of legislative change to ensure that the banks do start doing this?
Look, I think Minister Jones has been pretty clear on that. The Albanese government was elected to try and codify some of community expectations, particularly around the telecommunications industry. I think we've invested $10 million in initiatives to stop text message spoofing. That's where people receive a message which seems to be like coming from the bank, like it actually says the name of the bank in the header. Sometimes these messages appear in the same thread as legitimate messages. So we've made some investments there, and the minister only came out this week saying that he's putting the banks on notice that a mandatory code will be developed. So it's only a matter of time. I would encourage the banks, like they did in the UK, not necessarily to wait for this mandatory regulation or legislation, but to lead and to make these internal policies active now, because we know that in the meantime, billions of dollars will be lost.
I noticed some of the comments from the Australian Banking Association. They've described any sort of legislative moves here or any change in the practice here as creating a, quote, honeypot effect, effectively sort of getting scammers to ramp up their efforts, knowing that the banks are going to pay back their victims. How would you respond to some of those suggestions?
Look, I'm not surprised. It's an argument that's been used in the last day or two from banking executives in the inquiry. My main concern is that people are losing their money. You go to a bank, it's their job to keep your money safe, and there is definitely improvements that can be made to processes. Obviously, a lot of education needs to happen, continual education to say, don't click on links, don't send details to to unknown messages. Please be aware that people are trying to scam you. But I think the banks call it payment friction, where they can put plenty of checks and balances in place that don't exist at the moment to try and stop some of these scammers. I don't think the banks alone will stop scamming happening, but there is worldwide precedence where banks are a little bit more forthcoming in refunding some of these, just like happens with credit cards. Like, credit cards are an established system. There are chargebacks, there are unauthorized transactions, there are processes for people to get money back when there's been unauthorized transactions. But there seems to be a different set of rules for money lost to scams, even when people are tricked. And I think the community have an expectation on government, on telecommunications industries, on social media companies and the banks to do more. And that's what I've been using the last 2 days of the inquiry to try and tease out. There's definitely scope for them to do more, and I encourage them to do so as quickly as possible.
Well, Jerome Laxale, we'll wait to see whether or not there is indeed any movement in this space. For joining us today on Afternoon Briefing, many thanks.
Thanks, Matt.